Hello and welcome back to Sociology 101. I'm glad that you joined us today. I do want to make an announcement for those that have not heard yet. The new Calvinism book, which is actually Calvinism, a Biblical and Theological Critique. I am one of the many authors, contributors to this book that's put out by BH Academic editors, David Allen, who's been on the program several times, and of course, Steve Lemke, a friend of the podcast as well. And so if you haven't ordered this, there are some discounts that are available for pre-order because it comes out August 1st. And I'm going to get David on the program, if not both David and Steve, we'll work it out, to talk through that as well and offer you discount codes and all that kind of fun stuff. So stay tuned for that for those that don't have it. Of course, my books are always out there for those that don't know about the books that are available. God's Provision for All is a positive presentation of provisionism. People critique us sometimes. Oh, this is all anti-Calvinism. You never say anything positive. This doesn't say anything about Calvinism. This is all about God's provision for all and a positive presentation of what we believe about the goodness and the character of God and his provision for every man, woman, boy, and girl. And then this is more of my journey in and out of Calvinism. I think it's ironic and it's fair to Calvinists, but it talks about why I became a Calvinist, why I ended up leaving Calvinism, and then goes over a lot of the proof texts and some of the philosophical issues that Calvinism presents, some of which we'll be talking about today. I also want to remind you, if you would like to support us, one of the best ways to do that is to subscribe, to click that bell, and to share this on your social media pages. We also appreciate, obviously, those who donate on a regular basis, our monthly patrons. We could not do this without you. If you want to support us, click in the support link, a way to do that. You can figure out how to give a one-time donation or to become a patron. We always appreciate those who give. Now, today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be responding to Joel Webbin. Many of you may remember Pastor Joel. I debated him on Remnant Radio several months back, maybe even years back. I don't all the time flows together with me, and it's hard to remember when things happen. But Joel and I had a sparring match over total inability, in fact, over the T of tulip. And you're welcome to go watch that video. I think it's a good representation of both perspectives. And Joel is a kind man. It was good. He was an honest brother. He seems to be well-intending. I've said this about a lot of my Calvinist friends, but it's especially true of Joel. I really love the brother. But just recently, I was scrolling through YouTube on, just looking for different videos and stuff, and I came across Joel Webbin had a new video clip out just recently called "It's Good to be a Calvinist." Now, what it probably should be said, it's good that God determined for me to be a Calvinist, because on Calvinism, if the claims of Calvinism are true, the only reason you're a Calvinist is because God determined for you to be a Calvinist. And the only reason I'm not is because God, for some reason that I can't comprehend, determined for me to become a Calvinist for 10 years and then to reject it, and then to start a podcast helping people to understand why they shouldn't also become Calvinists. But when you hold to theistic determinism, you have these kinds of quandaries that present themselves that I think are insurmountable. I think they make life untenable, and I don't think they're biblically supported. Now, obviously, that's the point up for debate. And so in this little clip, it's only a 7-minute video. It's obviously a clip from a larger sermon, but I didn't put this clip out there. I didn't make the clip. It's from his media website that he's made this clip. And so I'm just playing it, and pretty much will be playing it in its entirety as it's presented there on YouTube, and then just kind of walking through and responding to that. I appreciate the side comments, the questions and the side comments. I try to pay attention to those as I can, because I'm not a producer. I'm trying to think and talk at the same time, so it's hard to read all the side chats, but I do kind of look over there occasionally. But Jason said this before we started, so I had a chance to read it, and I think he's accurate. Jason Stevens says, "I've always said the method does not matter, whether direct through meticulous determinism or indirect through compatibilism, desire, manipulation, and control. God is the first and sole cause." And that's really where it breaks down. A lot of Calvinists get a little upset when you call them determinists. But the truth of the matter is, tulip in and of itself, the claims of the system, do support a deterministic way of belief. You're born in a condition where you can't come to know Jesus and believe in him unless God irresistibly changes your nature, which causes you to come to him irresistibly. That's just determinism. And you can try to describe and use all kinds of different vernacular to describe how tulip works, to make it sound more palatable or more reasonable, but it all breaks down to determinism when you really begin to look at it. Compatibilism just adds another step in there that makes things maybe seem more plausible, because you're still saying people are responsible for what they do. They're still culpable for what they do, but yet God is the one who ultimately decides what they will decide in any given situation. And again, it just seems radically inconsistent with the pages of Scripture, and that's why we're pushing back on it. But without any further ado, let's listen to Joel in this particular message, and then we will, as always, stop and engage with what Joel has to say. Let's listen.
Right, we always forget the second half of the text in Philippians. It says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Yes and amen. But then it continues to say, knowing that it is God who wills and works in and through you that which is good and pleasing in his sight, that which is in accordance to his will. So the text literally says, you, man, have a responsibility. Moral culpability, human agency. You got to do something. And not just you needed to have done something, you need to be continually, presently, ongoingly, which is probably not a word, ongoingly doing something. But if that happens to be the case, it is only because God is doing something, right? God is the first cause. God is the first cause.
Okay, so God is the first cause. In some ways, we would agree that God is the one who is the initiator. But here is the assumption upon the Calvinistic system. It's determinism assumed over it, that God must be the irresistible cause. He's not only assisting or aiding us to will and work in accordance with what he has called us to do, he's actually irresistibly and effectually causing us to. Now, in our Calvinist well-intended efforts to give God all the glory for when we do anything right, even as Christians, because Philippians obviously 2:12 is obviously about Christians, in his effort to give God all the glory for what we're doing that's right, what he has unintentionally, very unintentionally possibly done, is also giving God the blame for every time we don't do something that's right. Because what he's ultimately saying is when you do something that's good and pleasing to God, it's because God has effectually or irresistibly willed into you that thing. Therefore, every time you do fall into temptation, every time you don't do what he's asked you to do, every time you don't obey him, it must therefore be because God didn't irresistibly cause you to do so. That's just determinism. And it ultimately removes the blameworthiness of even the Christian who neglects obeying God's truth. Even though 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, anytime you're tempted, you not be tempted beyond what you can bear, but that God will give you the grace that you need to stand up under it, to resist it. But yet, under Calvinism, you will always resist it if he is irresistibly, i.e. decreed, i.e. works in you to will and to do what you're supposed to be doing. Therefore, when you don't will and do what you're supposed to be doing, you can conclude, by natural deduction, it must be because God didn't will and work it within me. You see the problem? This is the issue with determinism. So look at the text that he's quoting from, and let's give it fair hearing here and look at it. Backing up to verse 11, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. So then, my beloved, so he's obviously talking to Christians, then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And notice Joel rightly said, this is your responsibility. You're to work out your salvation. But then he accuses people of forgetting the second part. I don't know any Christian that wants to forget the second part or leave out the second part by any means. I think we should understand and accept all of the text. But I don't think you should read irresistibility or determinism into anything, which is exactly what I think he does in verse 13. For it is God who works irresistibly in you, to irresistibly will and to work for his good pleasure. So the times you irresistibly work for his good pleasure, it's because he has irresistibly decreed for you to work for his good pleasure. Therefore, when you don't work for his good pleasure on Calvinism, what does that mean? That means he did not will in you to work and go and move towards his good pleasure. It's just determinism. Just take out irresistibility from the word. Just understand that God is the one who is helping you, who is working in you to give you the power and the ability to will and to work for his good pleasure. Therefore, I give God the credit, just like I might say if I was at an award ceremony and I received a reward and I just said something like, I could not have done this without my wife. She was with me all the way. I give her credit for all the things that she helped me to do. I would not be here without her. Does that mean she irresistibly caused me to do the things I did? No, but I'm giving her credit for the help that she gave me in such a way that gave me the ability to do something I would not have been able to do otherwise. In the same way, we're saying God has given us the ability to do something we would not have been able to do otherwise. Therefore, he gets all the glory for his provision, his gift, but we receive all the blame for when we don't partake of that provision, when we don't resist the temptation that he's given us the grace to bear up under. He gets all the glory for the provision, and yet we take all the responsibility for when we fail. If you remove determinism, the irresistibility part of Calvinism, off of this verse, you don't have that quandary anymore. You just don't. And that's what I want us to see as this audience. I want you to understand this very clearly, because you'll hear Calvinists often quote from verse 13 of Philippians chapter 2 as a proof that God somehow causes what you will. And that's not what Paul is saying in this passage, nor anywhere else, as far as I can tell. Let's jump back in to Joel's message.
Just the cue ball. We're just the cue ball that goes and hits, the 7 into the right corner pocket. And really, that's probably giving ourselves too much credit. We're probably the 7 ball that gets hit by the cue ball, that gets hit ultimately by the cue stick, which is ultimately guided by the person playing pool. You and I are doing something. We are. But we're doing something because God is working in us.
Notice even his illustration is causal determinism, reducing human responsibility to mere billiard balls. Now, I remember, I think it was Eric Hernandez, it may have been Braxton Hunter, one of my friends was on the program, and he used the billiard ball illustration as an illustration for determinism. And I remember getting Calvinists on the side chat saying, oh, that's a gross misrepresentation of Calvinism, blah, 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 blah. Or the domino, there was dominoes also used as one illustration. Braxton, I know, uses dominoes at times. And Calvin, oh, that's just a gross misrepresentation of our, here is an actual Calvinist using that illustration. This has happened several times, by the way. The whole the lion analogy that I use with the fact that lions choose to eat meat over grass because of the way God created them, and Calvinists, oh, that's not what we're saying. That's a bad analogy. And then I play Jeff Durbin using the exact same analogy in one of his messages describing human nature and sinfulness. This often happens is that we can try to represent Calvinists in vernacular they even use for themselves. And for some reason, we can be accused, nonetheless, of misrepresenting them. But his analogy gives a perfect representation of what Calvinism really is. Determinism is that really your actions are no more significant and meaningful than that of a billiard ball being bounced off of another billiard ball because God has causally determined what will happen in any given circumstance and situation. You have no real will of your own, but yet you're going to be punished. Imagine grabbing that 7 ball off the table and imagine it having feelings and emotions and real pain, and then going and punishing it for bouncing off of the 8 ball when it wasn't supposed to. Imagine the guy that hit the ball, the one who caused the 7 ball to bounce into the 8 ball to knock it in, punishes the 7 ball for doing this. And you're going, oh, well, that's absurd. That would be absolutely ridiculous. Exactly. This is why Calvinism has produced so much controversy within the church. It's why so many people leave scratching their heads when they hear it, because determinism, as William Lane Craig is quoted as saying, is dizzying. A vertigo sets in when you really begin to talk about theistic determinism and mankind not having a meaningful, significantly autonomous will from that of their maker. And again, this is one of the reasons I think that we have to push back on this kind of theology. It can be, it's not always, but it can be detrimental. I cannot tell you, I don't read them because I don't want to violate people's privacy, and I don't want to post things online that I haven't been given the permission to do so. But I get messages constantly, many of them former Calvinists who have come out of Calvinism now, talking about the psychological effect that Calvinism had on them because of its deterministic claims, of wondering whether they're truly elect because they still struggled with sin. And why would an elect person struggle with sin unless God ordained for them to struggle with sin? and not being able to stop sin because they continue to fall into temptation, thinking to themselves, well, either it's because I'm not elect, or because God has determined me as a Christian to act this way. And they're instead of really dealing with the root cause of the sin, they even subconsciously blame it on God, because that's what determinism ultimately does. Even when Calvinists go around saying, no, you're not supposed to blame it on God. But yes, our system ultimately does blame it on God and his eternal decree. And I think that's the destruction of this kind of philosophy and way of thinking. All right, let's move on.
And that brings up what you would call in philosophical terms an apparent paradox. It's not a true paradox, because the laws of non-contradiction are God's laws. God does not contradict himself, but there are things that appear to be a paradox. And one of the big, giant, apparent paradoxes within the Christian faith that we find within the Bible is this: human responsibility and God's sovereignty.
Not a paradox if you don't define sovereignty as determinism, Joel. It's really that simple. This is the same paradox that we've read 1,000 times. Many of you probably have it memorized. For those that watch this program regularly, you think, well, we've heard this before. We've heard that before. I don't do this video for those who watch on a consistent basis, just so you know. I do this video for people who are tuning in from Joel's church or from other places that are looking at, I want to know about what John Piper teaches on this. And so a lot of these things, because it's a centralized doctrine, are going to be repetitive. And we're going to go over some of the same things more than once, because Calvinism, being determinism, is going to have some repetitive things. And that's one of the reasons I use this quote as an illustration of the namesake of the system saying exactly what you heard Joel just now say. How it was ordained by the foreknowledge and decree of God what man's future was, without God being implicated as an associate in the fault as the author of the prover of transgression, is clearly a secret, so much excelling the insight of the human mind that I am not ashamed to confess ignorance. I daily so meditate on his mysteries of his judgments that curiosity to know anything more does not attract me. Again, from John Calvin, what's he saying? It's a paradox. It's an antinomy. It's an apparent contradiction. We can't get it. Yes, God determines your choices, but he holds you responsible for your choices. Yes, the pool player hit the 7 ball and caused it to hit the 8 ball into the pocket, but it's still the 7 ball's fault. We're going to take the 7 ball out, and we're going to punish it severely because of what it did that I caused it to do. And you may think, that is absurd, that is ridiculous. Prove that that is not what Calvinism is saying by looking at the best of their best scholars in their actual words, as I have on this program over and over and over and over and over again, all the while being accused by the other half of Calvinists that I'm not representing Calvinism correctly. And I'm just telling you, it's not a hard system to represent correctly, because it's determinism. It is God determines what your nature will be from birth by divine decree, or what it will be by rebirth if he's chosen you unilaterally before you were born. That is just determinism. And the effects of determinism, whether Calvinists like it or not, are demonstrably bad for the church and human responsibility and personal spiritual growth and sanctification. And we see this again and again and again demonstrated on this program again and again and again, how psychologically this affects people. And this impacts the way in which people live their lives when they begin to live consistently within the claims of a particular theological system. Moving on.
Which one is it? The answer, of course, is yes. That's the answer. The answer is yes. People are responsible. People have agency. People make choices, and they will be held accountable by God for the choices that they make. And God is meticulously sovereign.
So let me just interpret what he just now said, because meticulously sovereign doesn't mean sovereign the way everybody else means it in the world, which means ruler, has the right to do as he pleases. It means that he controls your choices. In other words, God determines what you will choose, but you're still making a real choice that you're responsible for and that you will be held accountable for. The 7 ball really moved. It really did its own thing, but yet God is the first cause of the one who hit the cue ball to cause it to do that. But mysteriously, paradoxically, the 7 ball is still responsible. That is what he is ultimately arguing for. And he's expecting you just to swallow that and to say, yeah, that's what the Bible seems to say. Where? Where does the Bible teach meticulous divine determinism of all things? It does not. Does it teach that God determines some things? Well, of course it does. Does it teach that God is sovereign over all that happens and he has control to bring about his purpose and his plan despite what free creatures do? Of course it does. But sovereignty does not mean meticulous determinism of every thought, action, and desire of man. It never has, never will.
And as the late great R.C. Sproul used to say, there's not one maverick molecule in all the universe. And if there was, you and I would have absolutely no reason to go home today with a sense of peace.
Now, I don't know what he means by maverick molecule. If he means by maverick molecule one that wasn't created by God, or one that can act beyond God's ability or power, like it's a super molecule, like it's a superpower molecule that's just, that has just this overwhelming ability and power to thwart the purposes and plan of God. If that's what he means by maverick, then I would agree with that. But if he means by maverick something able to move on its own initiative and in accordance with its own will and plan rather than his, in other words, something that's able to move autonomously, able to act or react autonomously to the given stimuli around them, if that's what he means by maverick, then obviously we have a problem with that. And again, this is one of the reasons that we quote Jonathan Pritchett so often saying free will is not a superpower. The illustration, best illustration I could think of that to counterbalance that maverick molecule thought is this concept and idea. Can you imagine? Imagine somebody saying, "Okay, if I don't control every single." At our house, we have these little sugar ants. I guess that's what they're called. My wife calls it little sugar ants because they're about the size of a little grain of sugar. I mean, they're very, very small, and they get into our kitchen sometimes in our cupboards. And you just smush them with your thumb, and they're just little bitty things. I mean, imagine somebody saying, if I can't get control over every single one of those sugar ants, then I can't be sure this house is even going to be standing when we come home. That doesn't seem sane. That doesn't seem rational. Why? Because a sugar ant hasn't the power or the ability to take down my house, just simply because I'm not controlling it. In the same way, a man or an angel or any other being in this world, just simply because it's not being meticulously controlled by God, doesn't have the power to thwart his power, the power to overcome him. Okay? Just because something has an ability to act outside of the will of God doesn't mean it's a super being that has the power to thwart the power and the will of God. God can give us a range of choices that are consistent within our nature. That's why I use the chessboard analogy, because the chessboard analogy gives us a platform on which to argue that the choices we're making are on the chessboard. They're on this planet. We only have the abilities that God has granted us on this planet. And so my ability to go left or right, to wear a black shirt or a green shirt, to take this job versus that job, are all within the confines of that chessboard of this earth and the way God's created us. But if I make a choice that's contrary to what God's desire and his will is, doesn't mean that I have become a rogue molecule, so to speak, or a rogue being that somehow can thwart the overall plan and purpose of God. And sometimes that's the way Calvinists seem to paint this, is that if God is not meticulously controlling every thought, action, and deed of humanity, then somehow they, by a superpower, could overcome the plan and purposes of God. And that's why the chessboard analogy of, coming across somebody playing both sides of the chessboard and asking, why are you playing both sides of the chessboard? And the man says, it's the only way I know how to ensure my victory. Well, that's basically what Calvinists are arguing about God. The only way God can ensure his victory if he's controlling all the molecules, if he's controlling the moves of the white piece and the black piece, both the good and the evil. If he's controlling everything, then he's in control, and therefore nothing can thwart his power and his will. And that's the only way he can ensure his victory, is if he just plays both sides of the chessboard, i.e. controls every molecule, controls every thought, action, and will of man. He controls everything. And what we say as the provisionist, and I think Arminians would agree with us on this point, is we'd say, no, sovereignty is much bigger than that. It would be like walking on down the boardwalk and finding another chess master sitting there behind a chessboard with the line of the best chess masters who have ever lived, as far as the eye could see, and one after another come to play him, and he's so masterful, so good at chess that he beats them all. That view of sovereignty says that he is ensuring his victory based upon his goodness and his greatness as a chess master. He is the best of the best. And that's why we know he will win, because he's better than his enemy, not because he's controlling what his enemy does. That's a higher view of sovereignty. And so we're saying, yes, the victory is ensured. Why? Because he can beat every molecule, not because he's controlling every molecule. He can beat every fallen angel, not because he's controlling every fallen angel. He can beat every sinner who chooses to go their wrong way. Why? Because he's better than every sinner who chooses to go their wrong way. And so our view of sovereignty is based upon the bigness and the goodness of God, not upon his meticulous determinism of everything that happens. It's a different philosophical starting point. And Calvinists really do believe they are promoting the glory and the bigness and the power and the majesty of God. Why and how? By magnifying his love, like the cross demonstrates? No, by magnifying his control over his enemies. Not his love for the enemies. But yes, the most climactic event in all of human history is the cross, which is a demonstration of his love for his enemies, not his control over the molecules and the enemies and the wills of man. It's demonstrating how much he loves them. He's giving up his power for unworthy vessels. That's what that's the central theme of the cross. Yet the central theme of Calvinism is God's meticulous control over everything that happens as power and might. The best way to demonstrate power and might in our world, yes, is control and power by being able to micromanage everything that happens. Yes, that's a human way of thinking of power and glory and majesty. But a divine way of looking at power and glory and majesty is to look at Christ, who, by the way, if you read Philippians chapter 2, it gives us a great illustration of this. Look back, let me put it this bigger so you can see it. Look back at who Jesus is. This is a Christocentric soteriology. That means it's a soteriology that's centered around the person of Jesus Christ. Therefore, if there's any encouragement in Christ, if there's any consolation of love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Do nothing from selfish ambition or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others. Why would he say, put others first, if that's not the nature of Christ himself, the nature of who God is? Because Christ is the perfect representation of who God is. Have an attitude in yourself which is also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God something to be grasped, emptied himself, taking on the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. Now, some people take this to mean this is God emptying his Godhead. This is emptying his God-likeness. So he's emptying himself, meaning he's emptying his God-likeness to become like a man. And I don't think that's what it's saying here. I think he's actually demonstrating his godness here. He is demonstrating his power, his might, his ability by emptying himself. In other words, to be like God is to sacrifice yourself for the cause of someone who is unworthy to be sacrificed for. He empties himself as a demonstration of what God looks like, not a demonstration of how to get rid of the godness within him. So when he empties himself, he's demonstrating what true glory, what true power, what true majesty actually looks like. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. For this reason also God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name. And at that name of Jesus, every knee will bow. So why will we bow at the name of Jesus? Because he meticulously controls all of his enemies? Is that the reason? Is it because he's micromanaging through sovereignty, quote unquote, meticulous determinism? Is that why they're going to bow? Or they're going to bow a knee in sight of his glory as one who gave himself up for others, gave up his power, didn't step on them to make himself look better, but instead allowed them to ultimately step on him so as to save them, sacrificing himself for those who are unworthy. Let's move back to the video from Joel.
That's what I don't get. I don't get when people who hate the sovereignty of God make the pithy statement, well, God's still on his throne. You don't believe that.
Okay. We do believe that sovereignty means God is on his throne, because that's what sovereignty is. It's kingship. It's lordship. He's the ruler. That's what sovereignty means. It doesn't mean determinism. And so when you say, I can't understand why people who hate sovereignty, what he's actually saying is people who hate meticulous determinism is what he's meaning. But nobody in my circles at least, hate sovereignty. What we hate is the misconstruing of sovereignty to mean determinism. And yes, we do believe, Joel, that God sits on his throne. And the question is, if God sits on his throne, does he have the power and the ability to make people who are able to make choices that are free and real and meaningful? I believe that in his sovereignty, he can have a world where he doesn't control both sides of the chessboard, but that he's still victorious because of his power and his might. I believe that. Do you believe that's possible? Because listen, I will concede it's possible for God to have created a world in a Calvinistic way. I believe it's possible for him to have created a world where he ultimately controls everything in the way that the Calvinists suggest that he does. I believe that's possible. I believe God is powerful enough, sovereign in your word, in the way you use the word. I believe in that way, he could have done it that way. Could you say the same thing about me? Could you say that God, if he wanted to, could have created the world in a way that the provisionist posits that he does? Because a lot of Calvinists will say, no, it's just not possible. He just could not have done it. Because if he were to give up the other side of the chessboard for anybody else to have any control, like that rogue molecule, then God may be thwarted and his will may be just lost and he just could get beat. That molecule might beat him if God gives up any control and any power. Come right out and say that. Come right out and say, I don't believe God is powerful enough to pull off the world that provisionists posit he could have. Come right out and say that your view of God is so weak that he could not have allowed creatures to have any form of real contra-causal free will, to be able to accept or reject his appeal of the gospel. Just come right out and say, I don't believe philosophically it's even possible for God to give that level of control to humanity. And then that way people would understand exactly what it is you're arguing.
So don't say it. Don't lie. You don't believe God's on his throne. Because God being on his throne doesn't mean anything for you. Right? Because, yeah, God's on his throne, but God has made a pact with all of humanity, like 8.2 billion people.
Who has ever said God made a pact with all of humanity from our perspective? Nobody. Nobody's ever argued that God's like got with heaven, got with people and said, hey, let's work this out, people. I'll make a pact with you that if you never. So this is already more of a straw manning of the other side, rather than saying God in his sovereignty, as A.W. Tozer has argued, God in his sovereignty has chosen to allow us to have the ability to make choices, and that he doesn't in his sovereignty decide which choice we'll make, but that we'll be free to make choices. Then a God less than sovereign would be afraid to grant us that kind of freedom. That's the kinds of arguments that we make on our side. We don't say that God has made a pact with all of humanity, like he's out there trying to wheel and deal with us as to how he's going to create the world.
That because God is so concerned about true love, he's going to have free will, because we've all heard some, beta theologian make that argument before, where, you can't have true love unless you have free will.
Okay, let's listen to a quote-unquote beta theologian. His name's C.S. Lewis, and his making that very argument that Joel Webbin is mocking here in his sermon.
Christians, then, believe that an evil power has made himself for the present the prince of this world. And of course that raises problems. Is this state of affairs in accordance with God's will or not? If it is, he is a strange God, you will say. And if it is not, how can anything happen contrary to the will of a being with absolute power? But anyone who has been in authority knows how a thing can be in accordance with your will in one way and not in another. It may be quite sensible for a mother to say to the children, I'm not going to go and make you tidy the schoolroom every night. You've got to learn to keep it tidy on your own. Then she goes up one night and finds the teddy bear and the ink and the French grammar all lying in the grate. That is against her will. She would prefer the children to be tidy. But, on the other hand, it is her will which has left the children free to be untidy. The same thing arises in any regiment or trade union or school. You make a thing voluntary and then half the people do not do it. That is not what you willed, but your will has made it possible. It is probably the same in the universe. God created things which had free will. That means creatures which can go either wrong or right. Some people think they can imagine a creature which was free but had no possibility of going wrong. I cannot. If a thing is free to be good, it is also free to be bad. And free will is what has made evil possible. Why then did God give them free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. A world of automata, of creatures that worked like machines, would hardly be worth creating. The happiness which God designs for his higher creatures is the happiness of being freely, voluntarily united to him and to each other, in an ecstasy of love and delight compared with which the most rapturous love between a man and a woman on this earth is mere milk and water. And for that, they must be free. Of course, God knew what would happen if they used their freedom the wrong way. Apparently, he thought it worth the risk. Perhaps we feel inclined to disagree with him. But there is a difficulty about disagreeing with God. He is the source from which all your reasoning power comes. You could not be right and he wrong any more than a stream can rise higher than its own source. When you are arguing against him, you are arguing against the very power that makes you able to argue at all. It is like cutting off the branch you are sitting on. If God thinks this state of war in the universe a price worth paying for free will, that is, for making a live world in which creatures can do real good or harm and something of real importance can happen, instead of a toy world which only moves when he pulls the strings, then we may take it is worth paying. When we have understood about free will, we shall see how silly it is to ask, as somebody once asked me, why did God make a creature of such rotten stuff that it went wrong? The better stuff a creature is made of, the cleverer and stronger and freer it is, then the better it will be if it goes right, but also the worse it will be if it goes wrong. A cow cannot be very good or very bad. A dog can be both better and worse. A child better and worse still. An ordinary man still more so. A man of genius still more so. A superhuman spirit best or worst of all. How did the dark power go wrong?
Okay, and if you want to watch the rest of that, there is a link in the show notes. It's C.S. Lewis Doodles. I love their website, by the way. You should listen and subscribe to them as well. And yes, C.S. Lewis, the beta theologian, as Joel referred to him as, is making the argument for theodicy. Why did bad things happen in this world? How does that work out? Why and how free will is necessary for love and relationship that's worth having? And of course, Joel just kind of caricatured it first and then dismisses it as a bad argument. But then he goes on to make an argument that sounds very much similar to that as we will listen.
And so God, because he's so insecure and has to be truly loved, he's made a pact to uphold the free, autonomous agency of 8.2 billion people simultaneously, which...
Joel, I just have to ask you, Joel, if Joel listens to this, if Calvinism is so strong, why do you need to straw man the other side in order to support your position? Anytime that people start to caricature the other views, that God's made a pact, that God's just insecure, these kinds of things that no C.S. Lewis type of theologian or myself or any other free will advocate in all of human history has ever said, if Calvinism is really as strong of a system as you say it is, it should be able to stand up against the strongest opponents, right? So why not still man your opponent versus doing what you're doing here in your message in front of your people and strawmanning it to the point where it's unrecognizable?
Which means that God being on his throne is like the same as saying that, there's a termite on their throne. They can't do anything. Right? If God honors all the choices of people and never is sovereign over anything, never working in anything,
does any of us say that God's never working in anything? See, it's extremes. It can't be the middle ground of God actually determining some things and working things out for his purpose and his plan, and us having free choices within the confines of our nature, within the confines of this world that he's created. It has to be either this extreme of God kind of wringing his hands and insecure and uncertain and powerless as a termite on a throne. And it has to be this extreme. Why? Because he has to sell this system to his people, it sounds like. It's what it sounds like. It's coming across to me as Joel's trying to sell determinism, i.e. Calvinism, to his people by making the alternative seem so implausible and so ridiculous that no one would even want to entertain those thoughts. But here's the problem, Joel. That kind of teaching creates latent flowers in the world, because that's the kind of teaching that I was under when I became a Calvinist. And it wasn't until I recognized and got outside my echo chamber of Calvinist that when I began to read Arminius and Lewis and Tozer and other scholars from my perspective, when I began to read their own words, I began to recognize I was being lied to by my Calvinist inner circle and by the echo chamber of I recognized they weren't at all confronting Arminians and what Arminians actually say, and they weren't confronting provisionists or traditional Southern Baptists, because none of the traditional or Southern Baptist scholars were ever saying any of those things that they were being accused of saying by my Calvinist teachers at the time. And so what you're doing, Joel, whether you recognize it or not, you're going to create some very strong, quote unquote, anti-Calvinist, pro-provisionist in your congregation when some of them begin to actually listen to what we're saying instead of the way you're painting us. And that's one of the dangers of caricaturing the position with which you disagree.
Then it's like, well, yeah, but he's sovereign over me because I have chosen to submit to his sovereign rule. I've made Jesus Lord. That's what it means for him to be sovereign. He's sovereign of his own because we submit to his kingship. That's great, but what about your pagan neighbor? And what if he chooses to get drunk and behind the wheel of his car, and he's on the road at the same time as you, and your 3 kids are in the back seat?
Now, remember, he's projecting this scenario if free will is true, okay? If provisionism is true, and this guy's out there getting drunk. But remember, this guy who's getting drunk on his view has been decreed by God to get drunk and go out and get in an accident and kill somebody. Just keep that in mind, because that's the alternative. Remember the name of C.S. Lewis Doodles earlier? The shocking alternative. What is the alternative to free will and the consequences of free will actions taking place as evil in this world? What is the shocking alternative? A world of automatons? A place where nothing real or meaningful actually happens? That's the shocking alternative. And so when you're hearing Joel paint this picture of this drunk driver, keep in mind what the shocking alternative is. That is a toy world of God actually being the one who sovereignly and unchangeably determined for that drunk driver to kill children and innocent people. So keep that in mind as you listen to this analogy.
God honors the free will of your neighbor. And God's devotion to the free will of your neighbor trumps his love and protection for you, said the Arminian.
Cite the Arminian who's ever said that. Because I think the N.T. Wrights of the world, myself, C.S. Lewis's of the world, would all say God is going to bring all things to right. He is going to redeem all things. Yes, you have to be patient. 1,000 years is the day to God. We may want him to make things right now. We may want him to bring that pedophile to justice now. We may want him to bring that bank robber to justice now. And he says, wait. Waiting on God is repeated throughout scriptures dozens upon dozens of times. And what is waiting? Waiting is faith. Faith is saying, I'm believing the promise of God that he will make things right. He will bring that person to justice. You know, that's what God says. I will bring vengeance, saith the Lord. You know, that's not your job. I will do that. I will bring judgment. In other words, the whole plan of the scripture is that God will bring all things to right, but you have to wait on his justice. You have to wait on him to do it. That's what faith is all about. So yes, this drunk driver who's doing this thing by his own free will, yes, that's causing damage to even good Christian people, yes, is not in accordance with God's plan, God's will, God's desire. He doesn't want that to happen. That's not what that's a fallen world that's happened. But God will bring all things together for good, and he will make things right in the end. and we cannot begin to comprehend how he will do what he will do, but we believe that he will. Versus he's the one who's actually, billiard analogy, causing the drunk driver to do these things for some sovereign unknown purpose according to his divine decree to bring himself glory.
Not the Calvinists, praise God. No, we think that God's love for his own trumps his devotion of protecting free will for the...
Play that out, because I think you and I both know of good Christian, solid Christian, faithful people who have had drunk drivers impact their world and their life by taking life or killing them. I can think of one I actually know who was a godly Christian man who was killed by a drunk driver, or some other free will evil agency. How does that work, Joel? You just now said, no, God's love for his elect trump that. So again, I don't know how your analogy to your people is actually working in your world and demonstrating what determinism actually looks like from the Calvinistic perspective. Again, maybe I'm just not following his analogy or what he's meaning to illustrate by it. I admit that, but I don't see how that's helping his cause.
Pagan. We believe that God is working all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And the word working is not God is salvaging all things.
Redeeming? Is that what you mean by salvaging? Redeeming all things? Yes, it's exactly what it means. He is working even bad things like drunk drivers who kill families and hurt people. He is working all things together for good. He is making them right. Okay? That's what that word means. He's presently, actively. It's a present active participle. It means he's actively, right now, presently, working all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. We absolutely believe that. Does not mean determinism. Does not mean God's determining everything that happens. It means he's working out good from everything that happens.
That's not what the text says. It doesn't say things are happening that are outside of God's control because people have free will, but when bad things happen, God tries to go in and, he takes lemons and makes lemonade. No, God is working. The root of the word, what it's saying is God is orchestrating all things. He's planning all things with intention. He's not just salvaging or fixing bad things. He is planning all things. And some of the things that he plans are bad things. But he plans even bad things for his good and glorious purposes. Think about that, just to give one example.
Okay, before we do so, I thought it was interesting that I remember this, I just remembered off the top of my head while he was saying that. I remember this from John MacArthur. It's an article from John MacArthur on the Grace to You ministry site. God is certainly, this is again quote from John MacArthur, God is certainly sovereign over evil. There's a sense in which it's proper even to say that evil is a part of his eternal decree. He planned for it. It did not take him by surprise. And again, we would agree with that aspect, is that the evil is not something that's taking God by surprise. He created people with the ability to make choices. He, of course, had an understanding and a knowledge of even open theists, for goodness sake, even recognize that God knows the possible worlds or the possible things, the contingencies that could happen when people are given free moral choice. It didn't take him by surprise. Even the open theists aren't so far to the left of the Calvinists, so to speak, to deny that that it didn't take him by surprise. It's not an interruption of his eternal plan. He declared the end from the beginning and is still working all things for his good pleasure. But hear this. But God's role with regard to evil is never as its author. He simply permits evil agents to work, then overrules evil for his own wise and holy ends. Ultimately, he is able to make all things, including all the fruits of all evil of all time, work together for a greater good. I could have written that. Matter of fact, I did quote that in one of my books, in fact. And that seems exactly the opposite of what Joel Webbin was just arguing. Now, why do I quote from MacArthur saying something that agrees with provisionism? Because I know that Joel Webbin's audience and the people who like Joel Webbin might not listen to the anti-Calvinist Leighton Flowers, but maybe they'll entertain MacArthur. Maybe they'll recognize that maybe MacArthur here is on the right track and not trying to suggest that it isn't about him making all things, including the fruits of evil, work together for the good. Maybe they'll be willing to listen to MacArthur's commentary on this passage, even if they're not willing to listen to mine.
The crucifixion of Jesus was a bad thing. Was Jesus a sinner? The answer is no. So what do you call it when people put someone who's perfectly innocent to death? Do we have a word for that? It's murder. Is murder a good thing? No. But did God bring about some good things through the murder of Jesus? Yeah. It's the only reason you and I have hope. I mean, we could go all the way back, not just the gospel with Christ, we could go back to the garden. I mean, there are days where I'm sure you feel the same. It's like, really, you had to eat that fruit?
Okay, so the argument he's making here at the last portion of his video, he's ultimately saying Calvary proves determinism. In other words, look at Calvary. It's a bad thing. It's a murder of an innocent Son of God. So that's the worst possible evil that could ever happen, is what many Calvinists will argue. And they'll use this as kind of their ultimate demonstration of how God can determine evil but not yet be guilty for the evil. Therefore, their conclusion is, therefore God can determine all evil and not be held guilty for it. So if I can prove that God determined one evil event in all of history in order to demonstrate that God could, if he wanted to, determine all evil events without being held guilty. Make sense? That's the argument that's being made. And I've, of course, shown this many times and have gone to much pains to try to confront this logical fallacy of this particular doctrine. One particular article I wrote years ago, does Calvary prove divine determinism? Because that's ultimately what he's trying to suggest here, is that if I can prove determinism, if I can prove that Calvary was determined, I can prove that ultimately everything could be determined philosophically without God being implicated as the author and the perfecter of sin, as Calvin put it. Here's what I wrote. John Piper and many other Calvinists appeal to God's work to ensure Calvary, as we see in Acts 2 and Acts 4, as their proof of divine determinism, as addressed in the podcast that's linked there. But does citing examples of events God has worked to bring about prove God brings about all events in this manner? If so, there are some significant issues that should be addressed. Here's a question for Joel and other Calvinistic friends who may be watching this. When we, as provisionists or Arminians, object to the concept of divine determinism, God's sovereign work to bring about all things whatsoever that come to pass, and you appeal to the crucifixion as your proof that God brings about all moral evil, are you saying that God is sovereignly working so as to redeem the very sins he sovereignly worked to bring about? Is Calvary just about God cleaning up his own mess, redeeming his own determinations? Appealing to God's sovereign work to ensure the redemption of sin so as to prove that God sovereignly works to bring about all the sin that was redeemed is a self-defeating argument. It would be tantamount to arguing that because a police department set up a sting operation to catch a notorious drug dealer, that the police department is responsible for every single intention and action of all drug dealers at all times. Proof that the police department worked in secretive ways to hide their identities, use evil intentions, and work out the circumstances in such a way that the drug dealers would do what they wanted them to do, sell drugs at a particular moment in time, does not suggest that the police are in any way responsible for all that drug dealer or all drug dealers have done or ever will do. We celebrate and even reward the actions of the police department because they are working to stop the drug activity, not because they are secretly causing all of it so as to stop some of it, which, by the way, is exactly what you have God doing. He's causally determining every single sinful thing so that he can redeem some of those sinful things that he is determined to come about. It really is quite puzzling when you begin to lay out the system for what it means. Teaching that God brings about all sin based upon how he brought about Calvary is like teaching that the police officer brings about every drug dealer based upon how he brought about one sting operation. Yes, at times the scriptures do speak of God hardening men's hearts, as in Exodus 7 or Romans 9, blinding them with a spirit of stupor, as we see in Romans 11:8, delaying their healing by use of parabolic language, as we see in Mark 4 and Matthew 13. And he always does so for a redemptive good. But the reasons such passages stand out so distinctly from the rest of Scripture is because of their uniqueness. If God worked this way in every circumstance, in every instance, then these texts would make no sense. After all, what is there for God to harden, provoke, or restrain, if not the autonomous will of the creature? If everything is under the meticulous control of God's sovereign decree, his work, what is left to permit and or restrain except that which he's already controlling? So in other words, for it to say that God stepped in and intervenes to harden Pharaoh's heart seems to suggest that prior to his stepping in and intervening, he wasn't controlling Pharaoh's actions and his heart. So for the scriptures to point out when God does step in to intervene to harden a man's heart, to blind him, seems to suggest that prior to that, there was a different set of circumstances. In other words, God wasn't controlling that person. So for the scriptures to talk about God intervening to control something seems to preclude determinism. It seems to mean determinism can't possibly be true, because what would there be to intervene on except his own decree? Like, I decreed Pharaoh to do this, but then I intervened to change Pharaoh from doing this to doing something else. It makes no rational sense. Is God merely restraining something that he previously has determined? Why blind eyes from seeing something they were naturally predetermined not to see? Why put a parabolic blindfold on a corpse like dead sinner incapable of seeing spiritual truth? In other words, why speak in parables if people can't understand truth anyway, even without the parables, as Mark chapter 4 teaches, as we've gone over? These are questions many, not all, but many Calvinists seem unwilling to entertain at any depth, and many aren't even willing, I think, in my estimation, in my experience, to really delve into to the meat of that topic, and they stay on the surface of these things. I think that's good enough. We've gone to our hour mark, and I covered the things that I wanted to cover from Joel's message. And I pray if Joel does hear this, he hears it with a spirit in which I'm saying it. Notice, I have not attacked the man's character. I have not called him this is all he ever talks about. Because, hey, guess what? Even though the only messages I've heard from Joel happen to be about soteriology, because those are the ones who come up on my feed and people send me, I don't assume that's all he ever talks about. Believe it or not. I believe he probably has a lot of sermons on a lot of different topics. And guess what? I do too. The fact that you come to my website that's dedicated to this topic and to this subject, and then therefore to conclude this is all Leighton ever does, which some of you on the side chat have done today, it's like going to my grandma's crocheting page and assume that all she's ever done in her entire life is crocheted, because on the crocheting page she talks about crochet. It's that absurd. I get on my soapbox sometimes because people should understand and know these things as kind of basic understanding. I don't imagine any of these Calvinists are going to the CalvinistCorner.com or to monergism.com or to any others these websites that are dedicated to promoting Calvinism and accusing their writers and their authors of only talking about Calvinism. I'm sure that's not the case. But nevertheless, that being said, I want to remind you, as we do all the time, as I think is important to our program, that when we share these things, we share them with love, that we can show respect to those while still firmly and vehemently disagreeing with what they're saying. So I can say, brother, I love you, but what you're saying is just not from the Bible. It is from a philosophy made by man. It is reading determinism over the top of words that simply do not mean what you think they mean. And I love you enough to say that you should reconsider some of these views. And so as you go from this place, share Christ and show love. God bless.